Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this RegGaming.com video we're going to be discussing two pieces of news which are doing the rounds at the moment, and a couple of you actually messaged me both news stories, so we'll get into them in just a moment. The first is going to be AMD and the successor to Vega. No, not Navi. We're going to be discussing Vega 2.0. Some rumours have popped up with that, and also some discussions are being had thanks to Destiny 2 and the PS4 Pro being unable, according to the developers, to handle 60 frames a second. We'll go into that in just a moment. However, first things first, let's discuss AMD working supposedly on a 14nm plus Vega 2.0. So, as I said, a number of you messaged me regarding this one, and it is essentially a culmination of rumours which a website by the name of WCCF Tech have taken and basically put out a news piece, and people are asking me my opinion. So I'll quickly give the, I guess, ground foundation. Back a few days ago, obviously AMD had their press conference where they showed investors and wooed them with the new technology that's popping up, and they showed three very important slides, but the one we're going to be focusing is on the graphics architecture, where they had a roadmap showing Vega, Navi, and Next Gen. With Vega, they had two distinct process nodes, 14nm and 14nm+. Now that's kind of weird to some, because, and this is where the confusion begins, because a website by the name of videocards.com, I believe it was early this year, but it might have been late last, but I think it was early this year, had a series of slides that popped up, and these were leaked, and basically, assuming they're genuine, which I believe they are, had AMD's plans for their graphics architectures, specifically Vega 2.0 or Vega 20. Now, its target release was the second half of 2018, and is touted to feature a 7nm GFX 9 architecture, in other words Vega, 64 compute units, which is exactly the same number as Vega, and 4 stacks high of HBM2 running at 1 TB per second of memory bandwidth with double the amount of storage space, 16 to 32 GB. We're going to ignore the rest of the specifications that are listed. Now, the reason that's quite interesting in my mind, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, let's discuss the specifications as a whole. 64 compute units means that there are no additional stream processors, so we should still see 4096, assuming they don't change the number and how they pack in stream processors per compute unit. Generally is 64, so if you have 64 times 64, it's 4096, pretty obviously. Second thing, the amount of memory bandwidth specifically. 1 TB per second is a bit weird, but it's also the amount of memory bandwidth which is quite interesting. Raja Koduri had told us that 480 GB per second is ample for the Vega architecture, specifically the new Frontier Edition. We don't know about the rest of the cards and what their memory bandwidth is going to be. So for them to double that, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say one of the things they're going to do with Vega 2.0 is to increase the clock speed. I don't think that's unreasonable. Let's, for the sake of this video, make an assumption and say they increase it by 300 MHz. I don't think that's unconservative. I think that's fairly reasonable. I would say that that's erring on the size of optimism, if anything. So let's say it's 300 MHz. So let's once again assume that they go from 1550 to 1600, which is current, all the way up to, let's say, 1800 to 1900 MHz. Let's even be very optimistic and say it clocks to 1900 MHz. Okay. That's nowhere near enough to need to double the amount of memory bandwidth, so that's a bit curious. So that means one of two things. Well, one of three things. One, the slide is inaccurate, and they basically made it with the assumption that Vega might not be as memory efficient as what it eventually turned out to be. Two, Raja Koduri was not being accurate when he told us that Vega with 480 GB per second is sufficient. I don't think that's the case, but, you know, it could always be. Or three, they're just basically erring way on the side of caution, and they're doing it for marketing more than anything else. And the fact that if you're going to 32 GB of RAM anyway, you might as well have that clock speed. And besides, this is also, you've got to remember, way back when basically SK Hynix and other companies were being very boastful, very optimistic on the clock speeds they were going to be reaching for HBM2. So who knows, maybe that this figure is going to be cut down, way down in terms of memory bandwidth now to, like, you know, 800, 900 MHz, depending on the final clocks of HBM2. So anyway, that was a long bit of discussion, wasn't it? So the important thing is that there is no reference here to the recent roadmaps to Vega on a 7nm processor, so it appears that the older roadmap is inaccurate, which means we can make the assumption that yes, Vega is not going to be re-released on a 7nm processor, which was once again the early rumour. Navi, it looks like, is going to be the first GPU on 7nm. The big question is whether that's going to be accurate or not. We don't know. I think it's going to really depend on, well, quite frankly, how well 7nm takes and how well AMD take to 7nm. And the second thing is, well, to be honest, if we're talking about Volta versus Vega, it's a very sticky situation, because if we were to look at the amount of CUDA cores Volta has, it's around 5120. If you do the math from the previous Titan XP, the previous Titan XP, and I was using Pascal, it's got 3840 CUDA cores, which is around 40%-ish greater than the 2560, which is found on the GTX 1080. So if you do the math on that, it turns out that, in theory, if the numbers remain consistent for the next generation of cards, Volta, the equivalent of GV104 should have around 3500, 3600 CUDA cores. We just don't know exactly, so I'm just going to, say around that number. So in theory, that means quite a lot of extra performance. We don't know obviously on the clock speeds of Volta and what they're going to be for the desktop, but we can make some presumptions based upon what we've seen previously from NVIDIA. For example, if you were to take a look at the performance of the Titan X from Maxwell, and then you compare that to, let's say, the GTX 1070, it's roughly on par. I say roughly because it does depend upon the game. And if you compare it to the 1080 is definitely faster than the Titan X. Once again, it does depend upon the game, upon the difference, but in almost every scenario across different resolutions, the GTX 1080 is significantly faster. Even at 4K, you're looking at like 5-10 frames a second, which might not sound much, but when you're dealing with games which are barely hitting 40 to 50 frames a second at 4K, that can be significant. Are AMD going to be able to counter Volta with Vega 2.0? Frankly, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. But honestly, it's just a bit weird. I think there is a bigger question, however. When is AMD going to release RX Vega? Supposedly, we're going to see a soft launch, once again at Computex, but, that doesn't mean a hard launch. And to be honest, that means absolutely nothing, because we don't know even when Volta is going to be released. I mean, Volta, we're seeing obviously the rumours that later this year we're going to see the server version of Volta, but that doesn't really preclude or confirm it a release for customers. So to be honest, there's a lot of speculation, and we just don't know. I mean, we could see Vega. To be honest, an optimistic idea is we could see Vega a pessimistic idea is that we'll see the equivalent of a difference between Vega 1.0 or 10 to 20 as like the difference from like an RX 480 to a 580, or optimistically, we could see a significant increase. For example, where we saw, Maxwell to Pascal, in terms of, yes, the architectures are quite similar, but there are some significant changes underneath the hood. We don't know, because ultimately, yes, I'm vastly simplifying here, but the main difference with Maxwell is it was optimized for speed. Pascal, it was optimized for speed, and therefore there were some other changes like the amount of CUDA cores per ASM and some other bits and pieces, but basically the architectures are very similar. Anyway, that was a lot of discussion, wasn't it? Let's discuss another thing that popped up, shall we? And this one, I'm sure, is going to really piss off some users. The frame rate police are wailing their sirens because recently Destiny 2 has been confirmed to run at 4K on the PS4 Pro, but it's being locked to 30 FPS because of CPU constraints. This is according to the game director speaking to IGN. Luke Smith said, and I quote, "It will not run at 60 FPS on the Pro. I don't want people to continue to hope. We're going to be matter of fact about that stuff." In other words, no hope for you. The PS4 Pro is super powerful, okay, but it won't run the game at 60. A game's this rich has physics simulation with collision and players, networking, etc. It won't run. There's not enough horsepower there yet. And he said that the GPU was powerful enough to render 4K. It was the CPU which is to blame. He also had remained pretty tight-lipped regarding the Scorpio version. They're not saying anything about that. So I've had a couple of people question me regarding this. Not, you know, what do I think of it, as in, you know, ha ha ha, the PS4 Pro, blah blah blah. It's more, one, why can it run at 4K? Why couldn't they run it at like an intermediary resolution, but sacrifice that resolution for frame rate? And two, do I think the Scorpio can handle it? Well, there's multiple questions, there's multiple answers to that. Sticking to the resolution side, quite frankly, if they're GPU bound, it doesn't matter what they did with the resolution. Presumably they could even run at, let's say, 1080p, and the frame rate just won't make a difference. They basically cannot push the CPU enough. It's just busy doing other things. So quite frankly, no. I don't think intermediary resolutions on the PS4 Pro would make a difference, so that's not going to help. As regards to the Scorpio, unfortunately the answer is a lot more complex. Now, you can make a very compelling argument and say, well, gee, the Scorpio is only 200 MHz faster in terms of raw clock speed than the PS4 Pro. For those who don't know, the PS4 Pro is running at 2.1 GHz for the AMD Jaguar. The Scorpio is running at around 2300 MHz, so once again, a 200 MHz increase. The problem is, you have other things to take into account. Supposedly, the GPU of the PS4 Pro has a lot of DirectX extensions directly built into it. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking away a lot of the workload from the from the CPU, because it's not having to issue so many draw calls. And there are, once again, supposedly, according to Microsoft and also Eurogamer, who were shown off the Project Scorpio, there is an awful lot of optimization on the console which essentially reduces CPU load. So if obviously you're reducing the load on the CPU, you're presumably increasing the amount of workload that CPU can do, so let's say increase the number of frames per second it can run. The other question, however, is, well, how much of a difference does that make in reality? For example, let's say that the PS4 Pro, and obviously I don't know this for a fact because I'm not looking at their, you know, development kits to see their, you know, the frame times and whatever else they're showing off. But let's say worst case scenario, the PS4 Pro barely hits 30 frames per second at, you know, whatever resolution. Let's say it's hitting 33 to 35 frames a second. Therefore, you know, when it gets really busy on screen. So let's say they're locking it down to 30 and it maintains 30 FPS all the time. Well, in which case, let's give the Scorpio very much the benefit of the doubt and say it's 30-40% faster than the PS4 Pro in terms of CPU. I'm being very optimistic here. Then we might look at a scenario where the Scorpio could hit like 45, maybe 50 frames a second. That's not enough to be 60 FPS locked. So we could see a scenario where the VSync is disabled, and obviously that frame rate goes up and down. Ultimately, however, it's down to the developers, it's down to optimization, and quite frankly, it's down to them to, well, you know, kind of announce that. So the Scorpio's clock speed does not preclude it's hitting 60 FPS, but really it does depend on how demanding the game is, and we just don't know. What is confirmed is that the PC version, of course, will be able to hit, I think, a ridiculous amount of frames a second. I think it's 144 or whatever it is at 4K, but yes, of course, you're going to need a beefy machine. Presumably, you won't need such a beefy machine, however, if your target's more modest, let's say 1440p at 60 FPS. Phew! I think that's just about it for this video. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.